a dominant culture takes away the sense of meaningfulness of another culture, these are the kinds of problems you're going to see, because there isn't a transmission of meaningfulness from a larger accepted sense of what life is all about, what Aristotle called happiness or eudaimonia, as a political virtue. If that sense of purposefulness can't transmit down to daily life, there's a problem, and people will suffer differently. So that the end of the world, end of our world, is on our minds around the world much more than it used to be, and we should expect our imaginations to be triggered by threats of world catastrophe. And I think we're going through a period not just of the threat of world catastrophe, but of being taken up and preoccupied with world catastrophe in our imaginative lives. And now, for that, I want to say we can do better or worse when it comes to our own imaginations. And so it's not just about the practical, what should we do next in the external world, but what is healthy and what is not healthy in our imaginative lives when we come up against real world problems. We will survive this. We will flourish again. Do I have any sense of what that will look like? No. But does that prevent me from hope? No. It's the alternative to despair. It's a refusal to despair, even if you cannot articulate what it is you're hoping for, other than in a very general term of like, for the good or for something good, for good for my people, something like that, not being able to do it. Now, that I just want to insist on one thing, which is that's very different from optimism. Mm-hmm. It's not optimism. It's not saying you think it will happen. It's hope that it will. And that's very important. For me, to maintain hope without being unduly optimistic is important.
Hello readers, my name is Grzegorz Jankowicz and I work as program director of the Conrad Festival. This interview, titled On Radical Hope, initiates a new set of festival events. Of course, we will see you in October during the this year edition of Conrad, but we decided to organize an additional program. Each month, we are going to present a conversation with a writer or philosopher. The new program is named The Nature of the Future. This is exactly the same title we suggested for this year edition of Conrad Festival. We decided to repeat this phrase, because with this additional set of events, we are going to contextualize our festival ideas and themes. So one can treat the series of events, these additional events, as a form of preparation. But each interview will be an autonomous reflection upon important phenomena and problems of contemporary world. Today, our guest is Professor Jonathan Lear. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, nice to see you.
Professor Lear is an American philosopher and psychoanalyst. In his books, he writes about many different topics, including relationships between philosophy and psychoanalysis. He devoted his writings to Aristotle, Plato, Kant, Wittgenstein, Freud, among many others. He works at the Chicago University, and one of his books is an illuminating reflection on how we can lose and gain hope after a massive cultural crisis. For many reasons, especially because of the pandemic, social and cultural crisis became part of our experience. This is one of the reasons I decided to invite Professor Lear and discuss this problem with him. So, Jonathan, let me start with some basic ideas, basic notions. How would you define cultural crisis, the collapse of culture and its forms of life?
Well, thank you. First, I just want to say it's so nice to meet you and be here with you in the way we can be in this pandemic time. Sorry, I'm not in Krakow with you, but another time. I don't think there is one definition of cultural crisis. And you're right. I think it's the issues around crises to our culture is very much on our minds now. And these are things I want to be thinking about. But the issue that I was most interested in trying to think about when I wrote Radical Hope was a kind of cultural crisis that I didn't think was getting enough attention in popular cultural imagination, which was an attack on what Aristotle would call the final cause of a civilization or of a political group, the aim or the purpose or the meaningfulness of life, the whole culture's conception of what it is to lead a meaningful, happy, rich, significant life. And the issue of the Crow people, the Apsalika people is another name, their name for themselves, came to my attention. I can talk to you about that. But because they did have their culture devastated, but they were never enemies of the United States government. In fact, they were allies. And so the standard cultural images of destruction, like that we know from like the Holocaust in Europe, these were not things that happened to the Crow people. They weren't physically harmed. They moved onto their reservation voluntarily. So in some ways, it looks like they weren't truly harmed. And yet, the aim or purpose of their life was destroyed. Their traditional culture was severely crippled because they could no longer hunt. They could no longer have a nomadic life, which was their way of life. They could no longer engage in the kinds of battles that were part of a meaningful life. And so they were, in a way, stripped of meaningfulness without having been physically harmed, or very much so. And so that's why I was interested in that phenomenon, the danger to a culture of having its meaning, purpose, significance taken away. And what did that mean?
And what happens to us and with us as human beings and as individuals, as society, as a group of individuals related to each other by culture? So what happens to us when such an unexpected cultural crisis hits at us with fierce power?
Well, that I think is an excellent question. And one of the things I have wanted to explore is what it is for there to be a trauma to the culture, and then how does that affect the individuals who live within the culture? And one of the things I've tried to talk about is we shouldn't think of all trauma as psychological trauma to the individual. We shouldn't think about it always in terms of a psychological suffering. That when there's a trauma to the culture, the individuals within the culture may suffer in all sorts of different ways. Different people suffer differently, and not everybody suffers. But the idea that I was trying to explore, and this idea really does come back from Aristotle, where Aristotle thought that, the unity of a culture, what it's really about and what is its conception of happiness, will flow down to all the constitutive acts within the culture, so that there is no such thing as, when a culture is up and vibrant, there's no such thing as just cooking dinner. It's cooking dinner within a context of meanings about which, having dinner together matters. And, certainly for the Crow people, the Apsalika people, cooking dinner was also getting ready for tomorrow's battle or getting ready for tomorrow's hunt. And it was lived within a context of meanings that included a large-scale understanding of what it is to flourish. And that is the problem that happens, is when even the day-to-day acts of cooking dinner, feeding the kids, sort of almost overnight, the larger context of meaningfulness, of like, why are we doing this, comes into question. And then people respond in all sorts of different ways. But at the level of social science research, I'm not a social scientist, but you can see among Native American populations that are on reservations, the mortality rate is much higher, the suicide rate is much higher, the drug addiction rate and its problems are much higher, alcoholism-related problems are much higher than the in the United States. And as I said, I'm not a social scientist, but what I believe is, if a dominant culture takes away the sense of meaningfulness of another culture, these are the kinds of problems you're going to see, because there isn't a transmission of meaningfulness from a larger accepted sense of what life is all about, what Aristotle called happiness or eudaimonia as a political virtue. If that sense of purposefulness can't transmit down to daily life, there's a problem, and people will suffer differently.
So, but how can we help ourselves to survive such a situation? Is there anything we can do before to prepare ourselves for the possible disaster, and after to overcome it? Because from what you said, it is very clear to me that such situation can happen to us at any given moment. It's not only a big historical event that happens once for a century. It can happen to anybody, any group of people united by a certain culture at any given moment. So is there anything we can do to prepare ourselves and to help ourselves afterwards?
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question you asked me, and let me start by saying, my fields are philosophy and psychoanalysis, and civil defense is not my expertise, and so I remember in my family after Hurricane Katrina. In the United States, it's very, where there's a very bad urban response in Texas. My wife went out, and bought a lot of peanuts and a lot of water. She knew that I would like peanuts if there's a real catastrophe and we're up on the roof. But around that, I don't have much advice about what to do. But the thing I think I can talk about and think about is our imaginations, collectively and individually, and health and ill health when it comes to imagining. And I think what you're raising right now, there are real life threats around the ecological catastrophe, dangers to the democratic political order. There's pandemic issues are raising questions of like, where are we going? Will we get out of this, or will it be another one? So that the end of the world, end of our world, is on our minds around the world, much more than it used to be. And we should expect our imaginations to be triggered by threats of world catastrophe. And I think we're going through a period, not just of the threat of world catastrophe, but of being taken up and preoccupied with world catastrophe in our imaginative lives. And now, for that, I want to say we can do better or worse when it comes to our own imaginations. And so it's not just about the practical, what should we do next in the external world, but what is healthy and what is not healthy in our imaginative lives when we come up against real world problems. You see, this is the thing we see all the time in psychoanalytic work. We find people who are suffering in their inner worlds. They may be very successful in social life. And the problems they state are very real. But the problem with their suffering is that although their problems are real, and although they're preoccupied in their imaginative lives with their problems, they're not doing it in a healthy way. And so all my work, I think, or an awful lot of my work, is certainly my recent work, is around this sort of issue. I do different things, but back when I was writing Radical Hope, I was very concerned. Firstly, I was historically concerned for what are my responsibilities with respect to being part of a culture that had such a devastating effect on Native American cultures. Wondering what they could do with their problem, but also what I could do to help. And part of what I thought would be good would be to do the best I could to enter into a conversation with them, insofar as I could meet them and become their friend, but also help us in our own imaginative lives with thinking about not just our past and what we've done, but also our future and what it is to, imagine what the meaning of a catastrophe is, what it is for a world to get destroyed, but you survive. That was the problem on my mind at the time.
You said a few things about what you wanted to share with your readers by taking this particular story, the story of the Crow Nation and their chief, Plenty Coups. But how did it happen that you encountered the story? How did you find your example?
It found me. It found me. So what happened was I was living in the time I was at Yale University teaching there, and there was they have a tradition of lunchtime lectures where young professors have lunch together and just try out their views or read a short paper. And I went just to a lunchtime lecture like one does, and I heard somebody, a historian, give a lecture about what it would be to write a history of the Northwest Plains of the United States. And in listening to that lunchtime lecture, I heard he quoted Plenty Coup, who said, after this, nothing happened, about the disappearance of the buffalo and their traditional way of life. And as soon as I heard that quotation, I felt like I was punched in the stomach. And then lunch was over, and I was sort of shocked, and I walked out, and then I forgot about it. And then really, I don't know how long it was, but a decade passed at least, maybe more, 10 years passed. And then I had moved to Chicago, and I was taking a long walk along the Lake Michigan, which is one of the Great Lakes. I live right at the edge of that water. And I walk along the lake pretty much every day and let my mind wander. And that phrase of Plenty Coups just came back into my mind. It just hit me, and I like from nowhere. And as you introduced me, I'm a psychoanalyst as well as a philosopher. So when something comes popping into my mind from nowhere, I don't just let it go away. I realized that, this had come back, and I thought, this has something to do, I've been called. I've got to do something about this. So I walked back to we have a great bookstore, really world-class bookstore in Chicago called the Seminary Co-op, and I found a biography of Plenty Coup, and I read it. And I just got started reading everything I could about the Crow people and about what happened. And then I just took a plane. I flew up to the reservation, and I didn't know anybody. I just went, but I looked up online. There was a tribal college, a college on the reservation, and I saw that they had the syllabus up, who was teaching what courses. And I saw this man was listed as teaching Crow culture to the Crow people on the Crow reservation. And I wrote him and I said, I do not want to impose, but if you would meet with me, I would like to meet with you. And he wrote me back and said, let's go have breakfast the next morning. And we went and had breakfast at a little cafe. And that's in like about 2004. So where are we now? It's a long time ago. And we're very close friends. We've been, I had an hour breakfast with him and I said, I do not like to impose on people. I try not to impose. And I said to him, after an hour breakfast, thank you so much for your time. I don't want to impose. And he said, well, what are you doing today? And I said, well, I think I'm going to drive over to Pleniku's house, which is part of a state park, about 70 miles away. And he said, well, I'll come with you. And so he got in the car with me and we drove together 70 miles across the reservation to Pleniku's home. And then it turned out he hadn't told me, but he had been involved in the restoration of that house. And so he knew every single piece of wood, every single, everything. He knew it, everything about it. And so, the breakfast started out at 8 in the morning and I ended up saying goodbye to him, I don't know, about 11 o'clock that night. And he's been my friend ever since. And he's, one thing has led to another, but I don't mean to go on about it, but that's how it started. And then he's introduced me to many people who have become my friends over many years. But I feel it was like it chose me. I didn't choose it. It's not like I set out to write a book about Indians and which ones should they be. I mean, that isn't how it happened at all. But I do believe in like one thing leads to another. Something, if you're confronted with something, you should do something about it. And I felt confronted by this. I didn't choose it.
Well, the starter, the phrase you heard during your lunch, after the buffalo went away, nothing happened. That is like a poem. This is something we have to interpret to understand. This phrase by Plenikoop, it's something really difficult to understand. You took it from there, suggesting that when our form of life collapses, things really cease to happen. For you, it is not only Plenikoop's feeling. It's not his attitude towards his and his nation's experiences. For him, the history really stopped at a certain moment. He was very active afterwards, but at the same time, for him, it was not the history going on. It was something else. So how history really exhausted itself, as you wrote in your book. What does it mean? How can we understand these phrases?
Well, that's a great question. I'll just say, I was very impressed with Plenikoop being willing to talk with a white man, as they say, and why was he willing to have a conversation at all? And also the question about what life was like now that they had moved onto the reservation was a question he kept putting off. When the biographer asked him that question, he wouldn't want to answer it. And then finally, at the end of the conversation with the biographer, Frank Linderman, it's in an appendix. Linderman says, I kept trying to ask Plenikoop what life is like, and he didn't want to talk about it. And then when I finally, Linderman says, when he finally got Plenikoop to talk, that's when he said, and I'll say the whole thing, it's after the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground. We could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened. So I thought, firstly, Plenikoop spoke to me. It hit me, and I wanted to pay him some kind of honor. The kind of honor I am able to pay. And I thought, I would try and write this book in a very different kind of genre than the standard genres of writing about history or Native American studies. I'm not an expert. But what I would try to do is try to, I felt he was allowing himself to have a book written about him for a wide audience like me as a reader. So I thought I would try and speak back to him. And I would speak back to him from what I could speak about, start a conversation or, join back. And it's one of the things I love about books. Conversations can span generations and space and cultures. And I thought I would do that. And so what I felt I could offer, I absolutely did not think I could sort of get to the bottom of what Plenty-Coup was talking about. I didn't know. And I don't know his psychology. But what I could do as a philosopher was to imagine what he might have been saying if he were trying to say something true, and if he were trying to stand witness to some deep, important truth. What might that have been? And what I thought about is time. And especially if you live in a world without wristwatches, Aristotle was a huge influence on me. He still is. I mean, Aristotle's a huge influence on me. I thought about Aristotle's understanding of time as he explains it in the Physics, where time is composed of what Aristotle calls nows. But to get the difference between this now and another now, you need a predicate, like now when we're going on a hunt, or now when I'm having this conversation with you, or now when we're making breakfast. So if you think of time as composed of nows, and you think of nows as needing some kind of a predicate, like now when we're going on a hunt, or now when we're going into battle, or now when we're preparing to go to battle. If your culture is destroyed in the way I was thinking the Grow culture had been attacked and devastated, you run out of nows. There's nothing, none of the predicates. Now when we're going on a hunt, no, there's no such thing. It doesn't make. It's not just there isn't one. It doesn't make sense. We're not going on one later or yesterday. I mean, it was a long time ago. And so I thought there was a way of understanding him as we've run out of the predicates by which we could say something is happening. There is no, after this, nothing happened. There are no more predicates of meaningfulness that we can attach. So it was a thought experiment. It wasn't meant to get to the absolute truth about what he meant. I don't know what he meant. It was what philosophers do when they try and think through. But it was my attempt to honor him, in the sense that I wanted to take him as seriously as I could by my understanding of serious. And I wanted to honor his attempt to have a conversation that opened up by agreeing to have a book. And I thought, I'll try and write a book too, and maybe that will continue a conversation. Maybe maybe the Crow people will read my book, and then they'll want to talk to me about it. And that's happened. But that's what I think he meant. I mean, it's not like, I mean, that is I think, serious way of understanding the claim if he were trying to stand witness to a truth. And the other thing I wanted to do, I mean, I've alluded to this, is don't try and make the world such that it's not Aristotle is over here and only ancient philosophers read Aristotle and Native American studies is over here and it has nothing to do with the ancient Greek tradition. Is there a way to help form a conversation where there's a unity in the conversation that's possible? And that, again, was my attempt to honor Plenty-Coup by joining in a conversation that wasn't just about the Native Americans. I don't want to put that just on its own reservation. I wanted to try and make it as open as I could.
Well, the conversation continues, definitely continues, not only there, not only between you and the Crow people, not only you and Plenty Coups, but also between you and, for example, me or readers in Poland who read your book and found it extremely important for themselves, because the book really can help. That was not said before. Plenty Coups said these words, expressed this phrase in which he stated that things ceased to happen, that history exhausted itself. But afterwards, after his culture collapsed, after devastation of his culture, he helped himself and he helped his nation. How did he achieve this goal?
Well, I mean, it's still a very tough story, history goes on, and we're all. There are many good things to say about what has happened. I mean, Plenty Coup was, of course, somebody who tried to encourage his people to embrace different forms of living that were more compatible with what was possible. In particular, he was very, he encouraged a lot of farming. He did farm and he encouraged farming. But it had. I can't say it's been a huge success. There's lots of problems. There are lots of problems still, and I think the whole issue of relations between indigenous peoples in the dominant culture. I mean, I think it's a worldwide problem, but it's certainly a huge problem in the United States, and we're far from having solved it adequately, or I think addressed it adequately. I mean, I think that the country as a whole, I can't really pronounce with any expertise, but I think the country, my sense is the United States is much more aware of racism as a problem, and certainly discrimination against African Americans is very widely accepted and recognized as a problem. I really don't think that the discrimination against Native American peoples, indigenous peoples, is understood or recognized in any. I mean, people will say yes, of course, but it's not. It's not sufficiently acknowledged. It's a huge problem, and it's going to be a huge problem for a while. I mean, I think there are a lot of good things I can point to, lots of good news, but lots of bad news too. There's a lot of pain that still needs healing. So there's both. I could talk about the good news or the bad news, but it's hard. And I'll just say in Chicago, my own city, it's at the other end of town, but it's a huge. I think it's the third largest city for indigenous peoples that are living in an urban setting. And there are like 65, 70,000 people in Chicago who are Native American. And the urban problems are very different from problems of people living on the reservation. But, by and large, the dominant culture doesn't really know about it. It's a problem.
You wrote in your book that we acquire certain kind of vulnerability as a result of the fact that we essentially inhabit a way of life. We inhabit a form of life. I'm using your words here, that you wrote that we are familiar with the thought that as human creatures, we are by nature vulnerable to bodily injury, disease, aging, death, some other catastrophes, natural catastrophes. But what does it mean that this form of life, this way of life we inhabit, makes us vulnerable? It's something different than things I mentioned. It's different than disease. It's different than injury. It's not aging, for sure. It's not death. How does the collapse of a certain way of life we inhabit make us vulnerable?
Yeah, thank you. It's a, you know, I would think of it as a kind of conceptual vulnerability, that the concepts of value into which we are inducted from childhood are not up to us. And the concepts themselves are vulnerable in the sense that the form of life that we live in with these concepts are vulnerable. So to take an example of the Crow people that I wrote about, I mean, on the one hand, at a sufficiently high level of generality, we thinking about the human condition, can think that we should expect given that we're political animals and we're social animals and we're vulnerable animals, we should expect that there will be something like courage, as there'll be certain forms that courage will be understood as, and in terms of which it will be lived. And the people who are courageous will be admired by the group that is saving them by their courage. But, if you take the case of the Crow people, courage was 100% understood in terms of bravery on the battlefield in front of enemies, and bravery when hunting in a nomadic life, very big wild animals. And that is the way it has been for hundreds and hundreds of years, passed on in stories. And the historians of the Crow would tell, sort of like Homer, it'd be sung. There'd be 500-year histories of that was the culture. I mean, these storytellers would have 500 years of history that they could chant out on an evening, which was all about the brave deeds of their past warriors and hunters. And everybody grew up with that, and that was what was special. And then really, almost like overnight, Friday you could do it, but Saturday it was no longer allowed. I mean, overnight, there was no more hunting, wasn't allowed. No more fighting, it wasn't allowed. No more nomadic life, wasn't allowed. You're now on a reservation, you have some food, and you have nothing to do. So where's bravery? How are you going to be brave now? Now, in our culture, you and I think we share, we sufficiently share a culture. I mean, in my world, a certain form of bravery is like speaking your mind to a group of people aren't going to agree with you. And I admire young students who in my classroom who disagree with me because they've got reasons, and I think, well, they're very brave, but this would make no sense to that's not a vehicle for bravery until it becomes one in a new culture. But what they had was like the breakdown of anything that could be considered courageous. And so, like, if I want to, I'm a young man, it was a male-oriented culture in terms of that form of bravery. There are other virtues that are tied to women, very important ones. But, if I'm a young man and I think everything about my self-esteem is tied up with being able to go out to a battle and earn the admiration of everybody, there's no longer anything to do. There's no place to go. There's no place to do it. And there's no available cultural vehicle for, like, let's do something else. It's just not there. Now, that's the vulnerability. I got born into this culture at this time, and it's not up to me that there's no longer any way to do it the way I've been taught. For 12 years or 13 years, I've been brought up on these stories and this and that. And suddenly, I turn a young teenager, there's nothing to do. That is vulnerability. And it's vulnerability at the level of concepts. I'm trying to think, what do I do to be brave? But all my conceptual training about how to be brave is tied up with something that's no longer available throughout the culture.
I guess we experience all kinds of vulnerability today. Of course, I do not want to compare our situation to the situation of crow people. That is not my point at all. But of course, the story you tell in your book can be also read and used in different cultural frameworks. So we can, starting with the story told in your book, we can think about ourselves. We can reflect upon what happens to us in this fluid, modern world in which culture changes sometimes abruptly. As you said, overnight, something can cease to mean, cease to be important for us, or it is still important for us, but we do not have a point of reference to realize it or to act it out. So it makes us vulnerable. I guess we experience that kind of vulnerability, of course, to different degrees, but still, it's with us. Why does vulnerability provoke intolerance, as you write in your book? How is it possible? One could assume that shared sense of vulnerability should make us more open to each other and more willing to cooperate with each other, with others, for example, to overcome the problem. And yet, of course, it's not only it's not that I learned about it from your book. I can observe it around. Vulnerability provokes intolerance. Why do you think it happens like this?
Well, I wish it didn't, and I think you're right that it needn't always be this way. But I think it is. You're right. It is characteristic of us as humans that, and I think psychoanalysts are very. This is something that really matters. Trying to understand people under pressure, not just at the cultural level, but individuals. That when I think it is characteristic of our psychological being as human beings that when we get anxious, respond to vulnerability with anxiety, there's a tendency for the very manner of our mental functioning to shift. And it shifts in the direction of, paranoia and what psychoanalysts called splitting. And so I find, I'll say that, this is throughout psychoanalytic literature, but the people who have worked in London, the Kleinian tradition of psychoanalysis, I find very helpful here, because what happens is under pressure and anxiety, the mind tends to function much more by dividing things very rigidly up into all good and all bad, and we want to keep the good and get rid of the bad. The Kleinians call this the paranoid schizoid position. That's the name they give it. I think it's a good name, but the idea is, under pressure, we can't hold on to, it's very difficult for us to hold on to a kind of ambivalence of like, well, you're good in some ways, but you're bad in others, and we'll work it out. It's like, you're all bad, and I'm going to keep the good. And also, I feel threatened by you, that you're going to take the good away from me, so I better kill you. And, this is a bad way to be. It's not a way for us to flourish. It's certainly not a good way for us to flourish together. And it's also true that in times of, times when we most need a more healthy response, those are the times where we're least likely to have the resources to give it. And so certainly, I'll speak about my country. You can speak about yours. But in my country, we're really suffering from terrible polarization of people. The other side is bad and we're good, and we just conversation becomes very difficult if that's how things work. But that's why it tends to happen. I think that we are creatures who, in response to anxiety, which arises in us via feeling threatened and vulnerable, we tend to split things up very rigidly into good and bad and push the good out, push the bad out, and then feel either that we need to attack it quickly or it's going to attack us.
Your book is not only a story of cultural collapse, it's not only about crisis. Its title is Radical Hope. So yes. How could we define this title notion, a radical hope? What is it?
Well, I'll say the idea is I wanted to take seriously Pleniku saying we don't have the concepts for which we can talk about things happening anymore. After this, nothing happened. And if things were ever going to start happening again for the Crow, they would have to reanimate the concepts they had in new ways, or they'd have to come up with new concepts by which to live and value. So radical hope is a kind of attitude or stance of hopefulness in this in-between period where you don't yet have the concepts with which to formulate what you're hoping for. You can't say, you could say, that's the idea. I mean, it's the idea is I don't yet have the concepts with which to formulate what I'm going to mean by good, but I have a kind of hopefulness that things will improve, it will move in the direction of the good, even if right now, part of my deprivation is I've been deprived of the way to say what's good in any detail. So radical hopefulness will be, we will survive this. We will flourish again. Do I have any sense of what that will look like? No. But does that prevent me from hope? No. It's the alternative to despair. It's a refusal to despair, even if you cannot articulate what it is you're hoping for, other than in a very general term of like for the good or for something good, for good for my people, something like that, not being able to do it. Now that I just want to insist on one thing, which is that's very different from optimism. Mm-hmm. It's not optimism. It's not saying you think it will happen. It's hope that it will. And that's very important. For me, to maintain hope without being unduly optimistic is important.
That was exactly the question I wanted to ask you about the difference between hope and optimism. So thank you for bringing this up. A few years ago, I had a very interesting experience. I prepared a set of events inspired by your book, 5 lectures and discussions about radical hope and its significance for ourselves as individuals and communities. And after one of the lectures, one of these presentations, one of these discussions, I was surprised by some comments coming from 2 persons, 2 liberal Democrats, who criticized the concept of radical hope because to them it is dangerous. It is dangerous because it makes individuals and societies exposed to ideology. I was surprised, I have to tell you. I didn't even think about it in this way. But what do you think about their reaction?
Yeah, I think I'm quite, in a way, I'm quite sympathetic to the criticism. I mean, I don't ultimately think it's correct, but I think any idea about, any idea can be misapplied, misused, not taken up in ideological ways. And so I think the one thing I don't mean to be doing is, in some sense, to say, I've got the right advice to give you, and this is its name. I think any name, in any concept can be misapplied and misused for, in particular for ideological purposes. And there's no easy solution to solve for that problem. It's part of the problems we live with. So, in some sense, I want to say I get the problem, and one should be careful with anything, but certainly with a misapplication of this idea of radical hope. But that said, I think that there's something extremely important that's available to the human, to us as humans, which says a lot about us and our possibilities. And it's important to understand that. And then each person has to make up their, as it were, lives, not just minds, their lives about how they're going to live. But I think this hopefulness, where you don't yet have the concept, but are not optimistic. It's not about optimism or false hope in the sense of optimism, but a dedication and commitment to the good, things being good for humans and being committed to that, being committed to life, human life, is very important. And it's a human potentiality that it would be, I agree that there's a chance to turn it into ideology, but I think the other danger, which seems to me very real, is to use complaints like it could be ideology to ignore the real possibilities for the human that are available. And I think this radical hope is a hugely important possibility that has been actualized all over in all sorts of cultural contexts. I'm trying to talk about it in as broad a formulation as I can.
I like the fragment of your book in which you write about the necessity of the crow poet who could take the past of the nation and make out of it a story which opens a new field of possibilities. What happened since your book got published? Was there any crow poet who have opened such a new field of possibilities?
Yeah, it's well, thank you. I feel the crow poets have taught me who they are. When I wrote the book, I didn't know who I was talking about. I was gesturing at a possibility of those, and I meant poet in the very wide sense, coming from the ancient Greek, about the makers and creators of culture. What happened, so the book was published, I guess, in around 2006. I kept up my, I continued to go to the Crow people. I made about 2 or 3 trips a year for all of these years since about 2004. The pandemic changed things. And kept meeting people, and we talked about my book on the reservation. I gave presentations about the book. I could tell you about that if you're interested. But one thing led to another. I think that's the shortest way to put it. And at the University of Chicago, I run a cultural center within the University of Chicago called the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society. So I was continually visiting my Crow friends on the reservation, and also I was involved with a lot of people in cultural institutions in the city. One of them includes the great Natural History Museum of Chicago. Is called the Field Museum of Natural History. And they have, by the way, the biggest collection of Crow artifacts of any museum in the world. I didn't know that before, but it's a coincidence. So I started bringing Crow people together with curators at the museum to meet each other. It was bringing in Native Americans to Chicago to meet with other cultural leaders. One thing led to another, and right now, I mean, there's a huge show, exhibition at the Field Museum of Natural History, where it's the first time in that museum's history. There are two important features about it. First time in this museum's history that the curator is herself Native American. It's the first exhibition of Native American artifacts at this great world, historical museum where the curator is herself Native American. And the second feature is that it was part of her curation that she did not want to do just a nostalgic show of all of their wonderful collection of artifacts. She brought together about 30 contemporary Crow artists, and they are in the exhibition as well. So that the entire, it's in terms of poetry, I think she's a poet because she's changing the museum. The museum didn't ever have contemporary work before. It was always framing Native Americans in the context of their history, their past, something to look back on. And that's what the original collection was about. I mean, if you think about it, it's crazy because all this wonderful collection of Crow artifacts is collected along with stuffed bears and snakes and bats and ants. I mean, this is natural history. It's it's nuts, but it was our dominant culture. And so she, is changing. She is a Crow warrior. I'll show you, I've got some photos to show you, but she is actually changing the very nature of the museum and what the museum thinks of it as what it is via her exhibition. And she brought in about 30 contemporary Crow artists to have a show that just looks to the present and the future as well as the past. So this was fantastic. I mean, I've got some photos. Do you want me to show them to you, or now, or should we wait till another time? Okay,
no, please do it.
So this is the museum, the Field Museum of Natural History, and now you can see these banners this is a contemporary Crow artist named Ben Pease. These are the huge banners, and Apsalica is the name of the Crow name for the Crow. They're Apsalica. And so here's a show. This is when you drive up to the museum. This is what you see, the art of a contemporary Crow artist. Here, these are, you ask who are our Crow poets. You're looking at them here. These are all writers, painters, poets in the regular sense, who have contributed to this new exhibition. And this is at the Neubauer Collegium, which is the building. It's the building I'm in right now, where we had a joint exhibition with the Field Museum, and we were the hosts. Now, all these Crow people have come from the reservation to be with us in Chicago, and these are the new contributors of art. Well, that's me and Nina Sanders. She's the curator, but just to show, this is, to join in. This is up in the reservation. It's in the Bighorn Mountains. It's just, this is the kind of thing I would do two to three times a year. Camp out there with people, sleep in the land with them, learn from them, what they had to teach me or wanted to tell me about. But this is us up there. This is the Field Museum. This is the major cultural institution, one of the major cultural institutions of Chicago. And you see all of the people on the staircase are Crow. They've come from the reservation as our guests. The Field Museum and the Neubauer Collegium, the University of Chicago, invited them all, and they all came. This was the first time they had a show that they took to be their show, and explaining the Crow people in the way they wanted to be explained, not the dominant culture. Here, these are some of our Crow visitors. Nina on the right, wearing a T-shirt that says Savage on it. In the middle is her grandmother, Margot Reelbird. This is inside a teepee-like structure that was part of our, at the Neubauer Collegium, our exhibition. It was a place, as you see, people could go in and relax and sit there. You didn't have to sort of look around at like a traditional museum. You could sit down like you were in a teepee and talk. And these are Crow people in the exhibition about the Crow. Again, here they are, another group in the front with the jacket. The gentleman, Grant Bulltail, actually he died of COVID since this visit, alas. But he's the spiritual elder of the Apsalika people, and he came all the way to bless the exhibition. Well, here I am. This is with Grant Bulltail. This is on the University of Chicago campus, which is an historic moment for the university because it's the first time we've had a huge group of Native Americans come to join us. And we actually had a parade. The parade was the idea of the Crow people themselves. It's what they wanted to do as a way of coming to visit. And here you see the parade. This is through the streets of the campus of the University of Chicago. Our Crow guests were in parade. And we even had horses. This we found, and this is quite wonderful. There's the university is on the south side of Chicago, which has a very large African-American population. There is actually an African-American riding club, a stable, and they lent us the horses so that our Native American Crow guests could ride horseback in the parade. And here is a celebration that was carried out at the Neubauer Collegium. And I want to show this is in terms of like what happened since. I want to show you a video that is, I think, quite remarkable. Listen to what Sean Reelbird, the announcer, says about Nina.
It's the first time in history that this kind of exhibit recognizing the Apsalika ladies have been displayed to the world of this magnitude. My Aunt Nina Sanders, she has gained a coup as a warrior lady with her knowledge, education, and anthropology. And you've seen it, you experienced it.
Yeah, so if you see, Sean Reelbird said that Nina had counted coup. She had made a coup. And so these were usages of coup that I couldn't have imagined, 15 years ago when I wrote the book. And now here's the collection. I'll just very quickly show you. Here's a traditional shield that from the collection. And then Ben Pease, the contemporary artist, and I would call him a great Crow poet, has made a contemporary version that, as you see, includes an iPad, neon lights, contemporary going forward. This is, for me, an example of like not just mimesis and not just nostalgia, not just trying to do something like a replica of the traditional one, but moving on in a new direction. Here, I think it's lovely work. The painting is again a painting by Ben Pease of his grandmother, but she's got the microphone, and but you see the floral designs are very traditional. And this a lovely new beaded bag by Elias Not Afraid, a contemporary artist, a beader. And then here's the photos of actually people who are related to each other. There's a traditional photo of otter that stays in the water. And then here's a contemporary photo of Margot Reelbird this is on the reservation. I know this piece of land very well, but the photo is also taken by a photographer, Adam Sings in the Timber, who is now a very successful photographer of indigenous peoples. And there's the end of it, which is that's what the banner is, this portrait of by Ben Pease. So that's just a quick, let's see, I've got to do this again, I think. So that's just a quick run through, but that's my answer to your question. I think that they taught me that there's a whole new generation of Crow poets, and that's what it's not like I knew that ahead of time, but I know it when I see it, that this is Crow coming to life in the ways that they're telling us who they are. And that makes me very, very happy.
Jonathan, thank you for sharing your ideas. I think that what you took from Plenty Cou's story, very particular story, is pretty universal. And a lot of us could recognize themselves in it. But the story belongs to indigenous Americans. And I guess it's very important to create a space for them to present the story by themselves. We can interpret it, we can use it for our purposes, we can recognize ourselves in it, but still they should present the story by themselves. Therefore, we decided to invite for this year edition of Conrad a writer who will represent Native Americans. Of course, there are a lot of groups, a lot of nations, a lot of stories, and a lot of writers. We will have only one, but still the conversation, as I said before, will continue. This time it will be a conversation with someone who owns the story. I cannot give you the name right now because we haven't announced the whole program yet, but in a couple of weeks everything will be clear. Next month I will interview Arundhati Roy. The situation in India is extremely difficult due to pandemic, but not only. There are other issues, other problems. We will discuss some of them, and we'll also reflect upon the role of a writer during such a crisis. So please, dear readers, remember last Thursday of June, be with us, be with Conrad Festival. Jonathan, once again, thank you for this very inspiring conversation.
Thank you.